Imagine a man who, for over 50 years, woke up every morning, walked to a mirror, and was startled by the reflection of the old man staring back at him. In his own mind, he was permanently 27 years old. Every person he met, every meal he ate, every conversation he had, it all vanished within minutes, leaving no trace. His name was Henry Molaison, and a radical brain surgery to cure his epilepsy had wiped clean his ability to form new memories. But here's where the story takes a turn that would change neuroscience forever. Researchers would give him a complex puzzle, like tracing a star while only looking at its reflection. He'd struggle, of course. The next day, they'd bring the puzzle back. Henry would have no recollection of ever seeing it before. He'd insist it was his first time, yet his hands would trace the star a little more smoothly. The day after, even better. Day after day, his hands learned, improved, and eventually mastered the task, all while his conscious mind was a complete blank. His brain couldn't remember, but his body did. This one man's tragic condition revealed a profound truth. Memory isn't just stored in our heads, it's written into our muscles, our nerves, and our very cells. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, the silent language of memory. We're going to unpack this astonishing reality of body memory, exploring how it extends far beyond the brain, profoundly influencing everything from trauma response to even elite athletic prowess. This isn't just about what we consciously recall. It's about the deep, often hidden ways our bodies remember and shape our experience, and what that means for how we learn, heal, and maybe even excel.
Henry Molaison's case, it turned everything on its head, our whole understanding of memory. Before him, the thinking was pretty much memory lives in the brain. The hippocampus, right? That little seahorse shape deep inside. That was supposed to be the main memory hub. Henry's surgery, which, removed parts of his temporal lobes, including the hippocampus, it kind of confirmed that. It showed how crucial that area is for forming new conscious memories, what we call explicit memory.
Right, explicit memory. So if you asked Henry what he had for breakfast like 5 minutes ago, or even his doctor's name?
Nothing. He didn't tell you.
That conscious recall, his explicit memory for new stuff, basically gone. But the star tracing, that part is still it's mind-blowing.
It absolutely is. And that's what really highlighted the existence of implicit memories, this other kind of memory, an unconscious one. It doesn't show up as a fact you recall, but more like a skill or a habit, maybe a conditioned response. Think about riding a bike, right? Once you learn, you don't consciously think, okay, now balance, now pedal, now steer.
No, your body just does it.
Exactly. Your body remembers. And Henry's ability to get better at that star puzzle day after day, even though he had zero conscious memory of doing it before. Well, that was proof. Proof that there are these deep forms of learning and memory that completely bypass our awareness. His hands, his muscles, his body held a memory his mind couldn't touch. So this one case, really, it was just shifted the whole paradigm in neuroscience. It forced everyone to look at how memory is woven into our physical selves, affecting movement, emotions, everything. It really opened up this whole fields of the embodied mind.
That's such a powerful idea. Memory isn't just like a library in your head. It's written into your actual being. So, okay, if it's not only in the brain, then where? Where do these body memories actually live? And how do we even define something that sounds, kind of intangible, but clearly has a real impact?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's crucial. When we talk about body memory, we're essentially talking about memories stored and expressed through the body. Beyond the brain's explicit system, these memories might be held in our muscles or connective tissues, maybe even organs, and definitely throughout the wider nervous system. It's all interconnected in ways we're still, figuring out. Psychologists like Thomas Fuchs have actually helped categorize these. There seem to be several distinct types of this embodied recall.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first type?
Well, the most commonly known one is probably procedural memory. You often hear it called muscle memory, right?
Yeah, like for sports or playing an instrument.
Exactly. It's the memory of how to do things. Skills, habits, built up through repetition until you do them without thinking. Like learning to drive. At first, every single action is deliberate. Clutch, gear shift, check mirror. It's exhausting.
Oh, I remember that feeling.
Right. But pretty soon you're shifting gears, braking, signaling, almost automatically. Your body just holds on to those motor programs. That's why you can not ride a bike for years, then hop on and mostly be okay. Or why a seasoned musician can play something complex without thinking about every finger movement. And this type of memory is incredibly resilient. Even people with severe amnesia, like Henry Molaison, or folks with advanced Alzheimer's. They can often still learn and retain new motor skills.
Really? Even with Alzheimer's?
Yeah, they might not remember the learning sessions at all, but their performance on the task improves. It shows their bodies are learning. separate from their conscious memory.
Wow, so the body really does have its own kind of hard drive for skills, super efficient. But what about, okay, sometimes you walk into a room or a situation just feels a certain way, maybe familiar, or it triggers a strong feeling, but you can't consciously place why. It's not really a skill, more like a vibe.
Ah, you're touching on situational memory. That's a fascinating one. It's how the body seems to automatically recall images, maybe sensory details, emotional states tied to specific past situations.
Yeah.
And it triggers responses that feel like they come out of nowhere.
Right.
There was this really cool study with mice. They trained them to associate a specific cage location with cold temperatures.
Okay.
Then later, they put the mice back in that exact same spot, but this time the temperature was perfectly normal, comfortable.
Yeah.
Their bodies still reacted as if they were cold. Their fur bristled, their metabolism kicked up. It's like their bodies remembered the association. This spot equals cold.
Yeah.
And triggered the physical response, even though it wasn't needed anymore.
Whoa. So the body remembers the context.
Exactly. And in humans, you see this with things like anniversary reaction.
Right, I've heard of that.
You might feel like you've intellectually processed a difficult event, right? But when a certain date rolls around, or maybe you encounter a similar smell or sound, bam, your body can suddenly get flooded with the old emotions, sensations, maybe even physical symptoms tied to that past experience. And you might not even be consciously thinking about the event itself.
It's like a hidden file cabinet in your body just got opened.
Pretty much. A file filled with sensory data, feelings, cues from the original situation. It triggers a response directly, bypassing your conscious thoughts. Your body remembers the context and the feeling, even if your thinking mind isn't actively revisiting the memory.
That can be really unsettling. Like an internal alarm goes off, but you have no idea why. What about memories formed not just by ourselves, but like with other people? Shared physical experiences. Does the body remember those connections too?
Well, absolutely. And that brings us to intercorporeal memory. This is all about memories formed and stored through shared physical experiences between people. Think about simple things like a really comforting hug, or the way you might unconsciously sync up movements when dancing with someone, or even just mirroring posture when you're sitting close and feeling connected.
Those subtle things.
They're not memories you necessarily think about later, right?
No.
But they get deeply embedded in your bodily responses. They can resurface as feelings, sensations, or just this sense of resonance with that person or situation. There was actually a study back in 2021, I think it was, in Frontiers in Psychology. They looked at this. They found that people who did shared emotional and physical activities together, like group exercises or maybe therapeutic touch, they had stronger emotional recall and felt more connected when they later reenacted similar body movements or postures.
So the body remembers who it was with and how that felt physically.
That's the implication. It suggests our memory isn't just mental, it's deeply embodied, sure, but also relational, co-created through physical interaction. It's like the body doesn't just remember what it did, but who it did it with, and the feeling of that shared physical space. It really highlights how these shared moments subtly shape our inner world and our bonds.
That's actually quite beautiful. Our bodies holding echoes of relationships, not just individual stories. Okay, one more category then. What about the really subtle ways we just absorb things, like habits, cultural gestures, without even trying?
Yes, that's incorporative memory. This is about the subtle, often totally unconscious way our bodies soak up and internalize behaviors, habits, even cultural norms, just through repeated exposure and imitation. It's different from deliberately learning something or having a strong emotional interaction. It's more about long-term immersion. Your body just learns how to move or respond by observing and unconsciously mimicking what's around you day in, day out.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about a child growing up in Japan. They don't usually get formal lessons on how to bow, right?
No, they just see it constantly.
Exactly. They see adults bowing greetings, apologies, respect. Through just watching and imitating naturally, their bodies gradually internalize the right posture, the depth, the duration for different situations. Then, years later, maybe they live somewhere else entirely. But if they meet someone from Japan, or even find themselves in a similar social context, their body might just automatically perform that bowing gesture.
Because it remembers.
Yeah, the body remembers the movement and its social meaning. It's this quiet, continuous absorption of the social world into our physical way of being. It shapes our posture, our gestures, our reactions, often without us even realizing it.
Okay, this is fascinating. But let's shift gears a bit because these body memories aren't always positive or neutral, right? We hear the phrase the body keeps the score a lot, especially when talking about trauma. It sounds like that connects directly to what we've been discussing. How does trauma leave its mark physically in a unique way? Why is it so different from just a regular bad memory?
This is where body memory becomes absolutely critical and honestly, often quite difficult to grapple with. What scientists and therapists have seen over years of working with trauma survivors is that traumatic memories seem to be stored and recalled fundamentally differently. A normal experience, even a negative one, usually gets processed. It's filed away as something that happened in the past. But trauma often doesn't get filed away properly.
It stays active.
In a way, yes. The brain and body can react as if the trauma is still happening right now, even years later. This can show up as intense physical sensations like a sudden racing heart or tension, or overwhelming emotions that seem out of proportion to the current situation, or just a general state of high alert hypervigilance.
Even without consciously remembering the event itself.
Often, yes, someone might feel this sudden, inexplicable dread or panic or freeze response. Their body is remembering the threat, the danger, even if their conscious mind isn't accessing the specific story of what happened. And this is really the core idea behind psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk's work, summarized in his book titled The Body Keeps the Score. He argued that psychological trauma hits the whole system, body, mind, brain. And crucially, he proposed that the memory of trauma gets encoded deep down in the viscera, as he put it.
In the gut, the organs.
Yeah, showing up as those gut-wrenching emotions, maybe even contributing to things like autoimmune issues or chronic pain, musculoskeletal problems. And this isn't just about big single events like a car crash or an assault. It can also happen with ongoing stress like childhood neglect or long-term abuse.
So repeated experiences too.
Absolutely. In either case, the overwhelming experience can get kind of stuck, stored deeply in the nervous system. The body then keeps unknowingly replaying that original state of alarm or shutdown. It becomes this living archive of past pain, essentially.
So the conscious mind might think it's moved on, or maybe even blocked it out, but the body is stuck in this loop, still feeling the original terror or overwhelm. I think this next story really captures that unspoken physical experience. For years, words were my cage. In therapy, I'd circle the event, a black hole I couldn't describe because it wasn't a story in my head. It was a humming dread in my bones. Tell me how you felt, they'd say. But I had no words for the constant low-grade flinch in my shoulders, the ice that lived behind my ribs. Then I met a woman who never asked what happened. In her quiet room, she asked, "Where is it in my body right now?" I pointed to my chest. She didn't ask me to banish it. She simply had me notice it, and then notice the feeling of my feet solid on the floor. For weeks, we just did that, a gentle oscillation between the terror and the ground. One Tuesday, as I focused on the ice, my left hand resting on my knee began to feel warm. It was a tiny island of calm. She guided me to stay with the warmth. And then, without warning, the ice in my chest didn't shatter. It simply began to melt. A single tear rolled down my face, not of sorrow, but of thaw. I hadn't conquered a memory. I had allowed my body to finally finish a sentence it started 20 years ago.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. It perfectly illustrates that implicit storage of trauma, doesn't it? Where words just fail because it's not a neat story. It shows how the body has its own language of dread, yes, but also ultimately of release. A language that can sometimes bypass the thinking mind altogether.
It really does. A truly moving account. And it highlights how important this shift in understanding memory is. Speaking of trauma, it's interesting. The word itself has a history, right? Our understanding of it has evolved quite a bit over time. Can you maybe walk us through that evolution?
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey, actually. The word trauma itself comes from Greek, meaning wound.
Yeah.
It entered English way back in the 17th century. But back then, it was purely medical. It meant a physical injury, a cut, a broken bone, that sort of thing. Simple.
Just a physical wound.
Right. It wasn't until the mid-19th century, really, with things like the Industrial Revolution, big railway accidents, major wars,
Yeah.
the doctors started noticing something else. They saw people, survivors, who had been through horrific events, maybe even had physical injuries that healed, but were left with these puzzling psychological symptoms.
Like what?
Memory problems, nightmares, anxiety, loss of appetite, things that couldn't be easily explained physically. After railway accidents, for instance, a British surgeon named John Erik Erikson described something he called railway spine. He thought maybe there were tiny, undetectable injuries to the spinal cord causing these symptoms.
Trying to find a physical cause.
Exactly. But as more cases popped up, especially from soldiers returning from war with similar issues, soldier's heart, they called it sometimes, that purely physical explanation started to seem less adequate. Then came Hermann Oppenheim, a neurologist in Berlin. In 1889, he published a really important book, The Traumatic Neuroses. And this was a game changer because it was the first time trauma was really used in a medical context to describe a purely psychological response to an overwhelming event, separate from a physical wound.
So a shift from physical injury to psychological impact.
A major shift. But ever since then, really, there's been this underlying tension, this debate. Is trauma fundamentally physical? Does it damage the brain? Or is it non-physical, affecting the mind, emotions? Or, as most people think now, is it a complex mix of both? That historical question still shapes how we talk about trauma today.
And it sounds like that historical debate really feeds into modern theories. You mentioned Bessel van der Kolk earlier. Didn't he draw a lot from an even earlier figure, a French psychiatrist named Pierre Janet?
Oh, absolutely. Pierre Janet is a huge figure, kind of an unsung hero in some ways. Van der Kolk explicitly acknowledges Janet's influence. Janet was working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mostly with patients diagnosed with hysteria. Now, that term is outdated, but it covered a range of things we might now see as dissociative disorders, maybe conversion disorders, or aspects of personality disorders. He was incredibly observant. He categorized patient presentations into different syndromes, like hysteria and psychasthenia, noticing patterns of psychological fragmentation.
Fragmentation. What did he mean by that?
Or Janet had this groundbreaking idea. He proposed that really intense emotional experiences, what he called vehement emotions, during a traumatic event, were the key. He believed that when an experience is just too overwhelming, the emotional shock is so powerful that it gets separated or dissociated from your normal conscious awareness and control.
So the emotion gets split off.
Exactly. And this leads to a fragmentation of the memory itself. Bits of the experience, the sensations, the images, the emotions aren't integrated into a coherent narrative of the past. Instead, they can manifest as what he called pathological automatisms. These are like involuntary physical responses or behaviors that just happen without conscious thought. It's as if the body is replaying a piece of the past automatically. For Janet, it was the shock, the sheer emotional intensity, that was the crucial factor in making an event traumatic.
So it's not just the memory of the event being broken up, but the raw emotion attached to it gets disconnected and then drives these automatic physical reactions. That really clicks with the body keeps the score idea.
Precisely. It links directly to Janet's core concept of dissociation. He described it as a diminution of personal synthesis, basically, a breakdown in the normal integration of experience. Terrifying events, he argued, are so intense they can shatter memories into these fragments he called pathogenic secrets, or even mental parasites.
Mental parasites, that's a strong image.
It is. He saw these fragments, these subconscious fixed ideas, bits of unprocessed memory, emotion, sensation as capable of lingering for a long time, hidden from conscious awareness. But they weren't inactive. They could produce behaviors and physical symptoms, the automatisms totally outside of conscious control. Things like sudden paralysis of a limb with no physical cause, or maybe automatic speech. Janet believed these symptoms, what they called hysterical symptoms then, were the manifestation of these hidden, dissociated memory fragments.
In his treatment,
his goal was to help people recover and, crucially, integrate these fragmented pieces. He often used hypnosis to try and access these buried experiences. Yeah. The aim was to transform traumatic memory, which keeps unconsciously repeating the past now, into narrative memory, where the event is understood and felt as something that happened in the past and is over. Weaving those separated bits back into a coherent, conscious story, that's his lasting legacy, really.
Understanding Janet definitely puts van der Kolk's work in perspective. But okay, while the body keeps the score has been hugely influential, you mentioned there are critiques, especially around the neuroscience claims. What are the main counterarguments we should be aware of?
Right. This is important for a balanced view. Van der Kolk's work has undeniably done a massive service in raising awareness about embodied trauma. But there are critiques, sometimes quite strong ones, suggesting that some of the neurobiological explanations in the body keeps the score might be, let's say, based on interpretations or manipulations of neuroscience, rather than strictly applied, verified findings. There are maybe three main lines of argument here.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first challenges the neurotoxic stress theory, NST. This is the idea that trauma itself directly causes physical damage to the brain. The critique argues that studies looking at people before they experience trauma, prospective studies generally don't support this idea of trauma causing new damage in humans. Instead, the evidence overwhelmingly points towards the diathesis stress theory, DST.
Diathesis stress, what's that?
Basically, DST suggests that people have pre-existing vulnerabilities, maybe genetic, biological, maybe developmental, that make them more likely to develop PTSD or other issues after a traumatic event. So it's not that the trauma creates the damage out of thin air in a perfectly healthy system. It's more like the trauma triggers or activates a vulnerability that was already there.
Okay, that's a really significant difference. It's more like trauma flicks a switch on a pre-existing sensitivity rather than breaking something new. That feels less deterministic, maybe?
Exactly. It suggests the trauma doesn't necessarily cause a brand new wound, but it finds and activates a sensitive spot. Now, the obvious challenge is ethics, right? We can't do studies where we measure brains, then expose people to trauma, then measure again. That's unthinkable.
Of course not.
But reviews of the existing research, including studies that did measure things before trauma exposure happened naturally, often find that subtle biological differences already existed in those who later developed PTSD. For example, one study measured skin conductance, a measure of physiological arousal in firefighter recruits before they started active duty. Those with higher pre-duty arousal levels were more likely to show exaggerated startle responses after experiencing traumatic events on the job. That supports DST, suggesting predisposition matters, challenging the simple trauma causes brain damage narrative.
Got it. So predisposition is key. What's the second main critique?
The second focuses on correlation versus causation, and specifically biological plausibility versus direct, unique cause. While it's absolutely true that people with trauma often show real physiological changes like altered cortisol levels, changes in heart rate variability, inflammation markers, those are real. The critique argues these changes can't be uniquely and directly attributed to trauma as the sole cause, in the way BKS sometimes implies. Vanderkolk, for example, often discusses the cortisol hypothesis specifically, low cortisol being linked to PTSD.
Right.
But the critics point out that low cortisol is also found in lots of other conditions, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, even some behavioral issues in kids. So low cortisol isn't specific to PTSD. It lacks diagnostic specificity within the strong claims in the BKS neurobiological framework. It might be correlated, it might be part of the picture, but it doesn't prove trauma is the single unique cause of that specific biological marker, setting PTSD apart from all other stress responses.
So the marker exists, but it's not a unique fingerprint of trauma. It's a correlation found in other conditions too. Makes sense. Important distinction. What's the third point?
The third argument tackles the idea of irreversibility, the notion that trauma causes permanent, irreversible brain changes. The critique brings up examples from other medical conditions. Take Cushing's disease, for instance. It's a hormonal disorder where the body produces way too much cortisol.
Okay.
This excess cortisol does cause brain issues, serious memory problems, even shrinkage of the hippocampus. Pretty significant impairment.
Wow. Yeah.
But here's the key. When you treat the Cushing's disease, maybe remove the tumor causing the cortisol overload, the cortisol levels normalize. And what happens? Often the memory problems improve, and the hippocampus can actually return to its normal size. Similarly, some neuropsychological deficits seen after severe traumatic brain injury, a direct physical injury, have also shown reversibility with treatment.
So even significant brain impairment isn't necessarily permanent.
Exactly. It directly challenges the idea that the kind of changes potentially linked to psychological trauma are inherently irreversible. It suggests the brain has more capacity for recovery and normalization than a strict permanent damage model might imply.
That really pushes back against a common narrative. What about the complexity of the brain? Does the critique suggest BKS oversimplifies things there?
Yes, that's another point. Critics argue that the body keeps the score framework sometimes simplifies brain science to make its case. For instance, using terms like the emotional brain, as if it's a single distinct entity acting as the heart of the central nervous system. Critics call this a made-up term that, while maybe evocative, doesn't accurately reflect the incredible complexity and interconnectedness of actual brain networks.
It's not that simple.
Not even close. We're talking hundreds of billions of neurons, trillions of connections. It's this incredibly dynamic, integrated system. So the idea that a specific spot like the amygdala can be permanently rewired by maybe one or even a few dozen traumatic experiences is seen by some critics as reducing the brain's structure to, as one critic put it, a comic book level of simplicity. The argument goes, if the amygdala gets rewired like that, why don't other vital areas like the cerebellum controlling movement also get similarly rewired, making us forget how to walk after trauma? It questions why one part would suddenly follow different rules than the rest of the interconnected system. Brain plasticity is real, absolutely, but claims of radical, irreversible, localized changes need really strong proof.
And the critique also mentioned an inherent contradiction in the theory. That sounds serious.
Yeah, it points to a potential tension. On one hand, the neurophysiological side of BKS often frames trauma as this objective biological thing, governed by universal biological laws, almost independent of subjective meaning. But then the critique notes, Dederkolk himself also emphasizes that trauma is fundamentally about meaning how an event is experienced and interpreted within a social and personal context.
So is it biology or meaning?
That's the perceived contradiction. Is it purely objective biology, or is subjective interpretation paramount? The theory seems to draw on both, which critics argue creates a tension. They also point to the use of sometimes broad, perhaps pseudo-scientific-sounding language like stress hormones wreaking havoc or maltreatment being a chisel that shapes a brain, without always providing the rigorous, specific scientific evidence to fully support those strong causal claims as being unique to trauma's mechanism. Essentially, the critique suggests that BKS, while incredibly valuable for awareness, might function partly as an ideology that selectively uses data to fit a pre-existing theory about trauma, rather than being solely and rigorously built upon verified specific scientific findings for its neurobiological claims. It's a call for discernment, really, especially when science is used to explain experiences that are also deeply psychological, social, and personal.
Okay, that's a lot to take in and really important context. So if we're moving beyond just the hippocampus and maybe even questioning some stronger claims about direct brain damage, where else are researchers looking? How else might these memories be stored, maybe outside the brain entirely?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, pushing the boundaries even further. And this next story kind of sets the stage perfectly. It speaks to this idea of history stored not as a narrative, but as a physical state, maybe even passed down. My father's hands always had a slight tremor, a secret rhythm only he and his coffee cup knew. He was a man of few stories about his time in the service, but his body was a library of them. The rigid set of his jaw, the way he'd scan a room, the explosive startle at a dropped plate, these were his unwritten memoirs. Now in my lab, staring at fluorescent scans of neural pathways, I see him. My colleagues talk about the hippocampus, the brain's neat librarian of narrative memory. But my research is in the periphery, the tangled wiring of the vagus nerve, the cellular memory of muscle tissue. I'm proving what I've always known. Some histories are not stored as story, but as state. Trauma can bypass the librarian entirely, etching its record directly into the peripheral nervous system. Every data point that supports a non-hippocampal model of memory feels like a translation of my father's silence. I'm not just a neurobiologist. I am an archaeologist of my father's ghost, digging through the science to find the shape of his unspoken pain.
That's incredibly poignant. Wow. A history stored as state, etched into the peripheral nervous system, bypassing the brain's librarian. That's a powerful image. So what is this research actually finding about memory beyond the hippocampus, in the periphery, as the story suggests?
It's truly cutting-edge stuff and quite revolutionary.
Yeah.
There's growing evidence suggesting that learning and memory aren't exclusively brain-bound, not even just central nervous system-bound in the traditional sense. A lot of this comes from experiments, often with animals where the spinal cord has been transected, meaning its connection to the brain is severed.
Okay.
Researchers have found that even with that connection gone, functions controlled primarily by the spinal cord, things like basic reflexes, pain signaling pathways, even aspects of bladder control, like chorition or locomotion, basic movement patterns, these functions can actually change and adapt. They show plasticity.
The spinal cord itself adapts without the brain's input.
Yes, showing partial functional recovery or adaptation. And here's the really crucial part. The cellular mechanisms, the biological processes driving these changes in the spinal cord, they look remarkably similar to the mechanisms we see driving learning and memory in the hippocampus.
No way.
Yeah, it strongly suggests that other parts of the central nervous system, like the spinal cord, and potentially even extending into the peripheral nervous system, the nerves connecting to our limbs and organs have their own capacity to learn, adapt, and, in a sense, remember. It radically broadens our map of where memory might live. It suggests memory is far more distributed, more embedded throughout our entire nervous system than we ever thought.
That completely changes the picture. Memory isn't just centralized, it's distributed. Which, going back to the trauma discussion, makes those claims of very specific localized brain damage seem, well, perhaps too simplistic given this wider network.
Precisely. It highlights the sheer complexity and interconnectedness of the whole system. Remember, the brain alone has hundreds of billions of neurons, trillions of connections. It's a vast dynamic web. So focusing only on radical, irreversible damage in one tiny spot might miss the bigger picture of how the entire nervous system responds and adapts, and where implicit memory, skills, habits, trauma responses might actually be stored and retrieved. It could involve the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves. It really opens up new ways to think about both research and therapy, acknowledging the memory held in our whole physical being.
Okay, so if our bodies are holding these memories, especially traumatic ones, and talking about it isn't always enough, what therapies are effectively working with this? How do we help heal or integrate these implicit body memories?
This leads us right into the really exciting and vital area of body-centered psychotherapies. These approaches are gaining ground precisely because they take the body's role seriously. One of the best known is Somatic Experiencing, or SE, is built by Dr. Peter Levine. It's truly body-focused. Its core idea is that trauma isn't just in your head, it's a physiological event that gets stuck or held physically.
Held physically. How does SE work with that?
SE helps people process that unresolved trauma by gently guiding their attention to their physical sensations. Things like noticing tightness here or a bit of tingling there, warmth, maybe coolness, maybe a subtle tremble. The goal isn't to force anything, but to allow the body to naturally complete the physiological responses, the fight, flight, or freeze responses that got interrupted or overwhelmed during the original event.
Completing the response.
Yeah. The core principle is that healing happens by working through these physical sensations, tuning into the body's own self-regulating capacity, rather than just trying to think your way out of it. SE often uses a framework called CBAM that stands for Sensation, Imagery, Behavior, Affect, which means emotion, and meaning. It's a way to gently link body sensations to feelings, images, impulses, helping people gradually regulate their nervous system stress response.
What does it feel like in practice? People often describe it differently from talk therapy.
Very different. Accounts often mention its gentle, sometimes slower pace. A therapist might just have you notice a sensation like that ice behind the ribs from the story. Notice it. Then maybe notice your feet on the floor, feeling the solid ground. This gentle back and forth, sometimes called titration or pendulation, between the difficult sensation and a resource of safety or neutrality, helps discharge that trapped energy gradually, often without needing to dive deep into the specific traumatic story itself.
Less focus on the narrative.
Sometimes, yes. Someone once described it brilliantly as speech therapy for the nervous system. It helps build resilience, helps people move out of being stuck in freeze or high anxiety, restoring that natural rhythm of self-regulation.
So feeling through it safely, letting the body finish its process, that sounds powerful. How does EMDR fit in? That's another therapy people often mention for trauma.
Right. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, is another major player. Also very powerful, but works a bit differently. EMDR is a structured therapy that uses something unique: bilateral stimulation. Usually this means guided eye movements following a therapist's fingers or a light bar back and forth.
The eye movement thing, yeah.
But it can also be alternating sounds in headphones, or even gentle tapping on alternate knees or hands. The idea behind it is that this bilateral stimulation helps the brain's own information processing system kick in. It helps the brain reprocess traumatic memories so they become less disturbing, less emotionally charged, healthier. It's non-invasive, and the goal is to really reduce the day-to-day impact of those memories.
How does it work? Is it just the eye movements?
Well, it's a whole process, actually 8 phases. It starts with history, understanding your background and identifying potential target memories. Then preparation parity, this is crucial, building coping skills, self-soothing techniques, resources to handle distress. Then you get to the assessment phase, where you pinpoint a specific memory, the negative belief tied to it, like I'm helpless or it's my fault, and the positive belief you'd rather have. The core part is desensitization. That's where you focus on the memory while doing the bilateral stimulation. The aim is to lower that emotional charge. After that comes installation, reinforcing the positive belief. Then a body scan to check for any leftover physical tension related to the memory. Closure makes sure you feel grounded before leaving the session. And reevaluation happens at the start of the next session to check progress.
It sounds quite structured and intense.
It can be, yes. Clients often report it feels intense because you are revisiting difficult memories, sometimes going back to the earliest or touchstone events that hold a similar negative feeling. That's why the preparation and resourcing phase is so critical. Having those skills to manage the emotions that come up is key. It's really aimed at clearing out those unprocessed memories that seem stuck.
Okay, so both SE and EMDR sound incredibly useful, but they approach it differently. SE focuses on the body's felt sense and releasing trapped energy, while EMDR uses bilateral stimulation to help the brain reprocess the memory itself. How do they compare head to head? And could you potentially use both?
That's a great question, because yes, they have different strengths. Let's break down the key differences. Focus. SE is primarily focused on the body's physical response and releasing that stored fight, fight, freeze energy. EMDR is more focused on the brain's processing of the traumatic memory itself. Technique. SE uses things like body awareness, noticing sensations, gentle movement, breath work, mindfulness. EMDR's core technique is that bilateral stimulation. Eyes, sounds, taps. Trauma processing. SE processes trauma through the body, encouraging awareness of physical sensations to allow for natural discharge and regulation. EMDR processes trauma primarily in the mind, though acknowledging the body scan component, aiming to change how the memory is stored and accessed in the brain.
So different entry points. When might you choose one over the other?
Well, SE might be particularly helpful if someone feels really disconnected from their body or has a lot of physical symptoms they suspect are trauma-related, like chronic pain, digestive issues, numbness, or if talk therapy just hasn't felt helpful. EMDR is often recommended for specific, intrusive, distressing memories, diagnosed PTSD, nightmares, or flashbacks. It can also be good if someone wants to process trauma without having to talk about the details extensively.
And combining them, is that possible?
Absolutely. In fact, many therapists find that combining them can be incredibly effective, offering a really holistic approach. EMDR can be fantastic for targeting and reprocessing those specific high-charge memories, reducing their intensity. And somatic work, like SE, can be invaluable for addressing the physical holding patterns, releasing the bodily tension, and helping regulate the nervous system overall. Often, a therapist might start with some somatic work first, help the person reconnect with their body, build that sense of internal safety and grounding, maybe release some initial layers of physical tension.
Laying the groundwork.
Exactly. Then, once there's a bit more stability and body awareness, EMDR can be introduced to work on those specific memory targets more directly. It allows for a layered approach, addressing both the mental and physical sides of the trauma imprint.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's pivot completely now. From trauma healing to peak performance. Elite athletes. How do these same principles of body memory, this embodied knowledge, show up in the world of sports and complex motor skills?
This is where procedural memory really takes center stage, often in incredibly high-stakes situations. Elite performance absolutely depends on subconscious control. Automatic execution of skills learned over thousands, maybe millions, of repetitions. Conscious thinking often just gets in the way. This next story illustrates that perfectly, the shift from thinking about it to letting the body do it. 10 meters is a long way down when you're thinking about it. My new dive, the inward 3.5 somersault pike, was technically perfect in my head. I could diagram every angle, every microsecond of muscle contraction. But in the air, I was a mess of thoughts. A committee meeting happening when I needed a king. I'd bail out, over-rotate, lose my form. "Anya," my coach said, his voice raw with frustration. "You know this dive. Your body knows it. Your mind is the rookie here." The next time on the platform, I didn't recite the steps. I took a breath and tried to remember not the mechanics, but the feeling of 1,000 successful dives before. I remember the kinesthetic hum of being perfectly balanced, the pure procedural knowledge encoded in my limbs. I pushed off the board and emptied my head. There was no thought, only flow. My body wasn't following instructions. It was telling a story it had practiced to perfection. The entry was silent, a blade slicing through the water. As I surfaced, I wasn't proud of my mind for figuring it out. I was humbled by my body for having known it all along.
Wow, your mind is the rookie here. That's brilliant. Letting go of the thoughts and tapping into that kinesthetic hum, that feeling the body already knows. What's the science behind that? How does an athlete develop that incredibly precise automatic control?
That kinesthetic hum is a great way to put it. It relates strongly to something called Schmidt's schema theory in motor learning. The theory basically suggests that when an elite athlete performs a skill, their brain is constantly, subconsciously comparing the kinesthetic feeling, how the movement actually feels right now in the moment, to an internal template or schema. This schema is built up from all those countless practice repetitions. It represents how the athlete expects the movement to feel when it's done correctly.
So it's a feeling-based comparison.
Exactly. If the real-time feeling matches the template, it feels good, feels right. The brain gets positive feedback. If there's a mismatch, something feels off, wrong. And often, the body can make tiny, instantaneous corrections without the athlete even consciously thinking about it. This whole process relies heavily on proprioceptive feedback. That's our body's internal sense of where its parts are, how they're moving, how much effort they're using, all without needing to look.
Like knowing where your hand is with your eyes closed.
Precisely. That proprioceptive sense is crucial for the subconscious control needed in sports. It allows athletes to perform incredibly complex actions, make split-second decisions in a game, maintain perfect balance as a gymnast, all without consciously managing every single muscle contraction. They trust their body's ingrained memory, that kinesthetic feel.
It's like an internal guidance system honed through practice. Okay, so if athletes rely so much on this embodied kinesthetic learning, what does that mean for coaching? How do elite athletes actually prefer to learn?
That's a really practical, important question. There was a study that used the VARK questionnaire that assesses preferences for visual, oral, hearing, read-write, and kinesthetic learning styles, specifically with athletes. The results were pretty clear. Athletes showed a massive preference for kinesthetic K learning. That was the dominant style for 38% of them. And another big chunk, 32%, were multimodal, meaning they used a mix, but kinesthetic was usually a strong component.
So overwhelmingly, they learn by doing.
Absolutely. They learn best through practice, through real-life examples, through physical demonstrations, hands-on approaches. Just listening to instructions or reading a manual is way less effective for most of them than actually feeling the movement. And here's something really striking. Only 1%, just 1%, had a primary visual learning preference.
Only 1%. So all those charts and diagrams coaches sometimes use
Might not be hitting the mark for the vast majority of athletes. They need to see it in action, feel it themselves. The study also found some interesting gender differences. Male athletes tended to have a slightly higher preference for oral, A, learning, benefiting from spoken explanations, discussions about technique. Female athletes were more likely to be multimodal, adaptable to different styles.
Okay, so what's the takeaway for coaches?
The big takeaway is prioritize kinesthetic methods. Use active drills. Provide lots of opportunities for guided practice. Give feedback focused on the feel of the movement. Use demonstrations, maybe stories or case studies that evoke that physical sense. And if you're working with male athletes, definitely incorporate clear verbal explanations and encourage discussion too. Knowing these preferences helps coaches tailor their approach and really connect with how athletes actually build that body memory.
That's super practical. Tailor the teaching to the learning style. But what happens when an athlete has learned something, but they've learned it wrong? They've got a bad habit deeply ingrained in their body memory. How hard is it to reteach the body then?
Oh, that is one of the toughest challenges in coaching. It's often called the relearning phase, and it can be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved. The core problem is what's sometimes called the feels right is wrong paradox.
Feels right is wrong.
Yeah. The old, incorrect way of doing the skill, even if it's flawed or inefficient, feels right to the athlete on a subconscious level. Why? Because they've practiced it thousands of times. It's deeply embedded in their procedural memory. It's the default setting. Meanwhile, the new, correct way, the technique the coach is trying to teach, that often feels awkward, unnatural, maybe even just plain wrong. Because it's unfamiliar. It hasn't been practiced enough to become part of their ingrained body memory yet.
So their body's memory is fighting the change.
Exactly. It powerfully shows just how strong that ingrained body memory is and how hard it is to override those subconscious patterns. It's not just about understanding intellectually what needs to change. It's about physically repatterning years of experience. This is where the coach's skill is really tested. They need to help the athlete become highly aware of, analyze, and then actively reinforce the correct kinesthetic feedback.
How do they do that?
Questioning feedback techniques are key here. Instead of just saying, do this, the coach asks things like, okay, how did that feel compared to the last one? Or what exactly were you focusing on in your body during that movement? These kinds of open-ended questions force the athlete to pay close attention to the specific sensory information of the new, correct movement. It makes them an active participant in analyzing the feel, not just passively receiving instructions. It helps them consciously connect with and start to internalize the new pattern until eventually that starts to feel right.
This has been such a fascinating journey, really, starting with Henry Molaison and how his case just blew open our understanding of memory, showing it lives beyond just the brain, then diving into how trauma can leave these deep, silent imprints on the body, and the therapies emerging to work directly with that. And finally, seeing how elite athletes rely on this profound embodied knowledge, this procedural memory honed through practice, it really makes you appreciate how much of who we are is stored not just in our thoughts, but right here in our physical selves.
It really does underscore a fundamental point, doesn't it? Our bodies are like this vast living archive, holding everything from simple skills that let us walk and talk to those deeply etched patterns from past experiences, both good and bad. These implicit memories, mostly operating beneath our conscious awareness, are constantly shaping us. How we feel, how we react, how we move through the world. They're not just footnotes, they're foundational, quietly narrating our past and influencing our present and future every single moment.
And realizing that, understanding the silent language, it really opens up new possibilities, doesn't it? Whether it's finding new paths to healing through therapies that honor the body's wisdom when words aren't enough, or optimizing performance by truly understanding how skills become embodied. Acknowledging and working with this deep intelligence within our physical selves just seems to unlock so much potential. It reveals that our deepest wisdom might not just be in what we consciously know, but in how our entire being remembers, adapts, and ultimately strives.